Time. Morning, everyone. Hope everyone had a good Thanksgiving.
You too. You too. How did Covey look in his first action?
Yeah, obviously a familiar face with Covey. I thought he did a good job. Difficult conditions out there being windy. Only had really that one opportunity to return it. I thought he did a nice job. It was one of those punts that we call it was so bad it was good in terms of it came off Torrey Taylor's foot kind of sideways and it was short. Then it just kept rolling. And we didn't know, if he didn't pick that up, who knows where that ball would have rolled to. Could have been to the 15, things of that nature. He did a good job of kind of corralling it, getting square. Then he made 2 misses and got 9 yards out of it, and kind of vintage Covey making something out of nothing, to get us that first down in terms of the return. So I thought he did a good job of battling against, the conditions, the kickers, the punters right there. So it was a good to have a familiar face back there and Covey back.
Is that the way that's coached, like when a ball's bouncing like that?
Yeah, obviously we want to try and catch everything, but at times, sometimes it's just a mishit and it's short and everything of that nature. And obviously you don't want to put, the team at risk if you can't really corral it. And it's like, all right, let's just salvage it and see the next play down. But it was careening towards our end zone at a pretty good pace there, and he did a good job of just kind of corralling and getting what he could off of it.
You mentioned a tough kicking day in general. The missed kicks by Jake, is it more chalked up to that, or did you see anything from a technique standpoint or anything like that?
Yeah, with the extra point, obviously, we just can't, we want to make sure when, we have those closer range field goals, extra points, that we do our job and get points on the board and don't put ourselves in the scenario that we did have to do at the end of the game. I thought he struck that 52-yarder pretty well. It was just in the tougher end of the stadium, going into the wind. It was going straight. Then obviously, the wind coming out the west was bouncing back off the stands, and it took it at the end right there. But obviously, I'm not too upset about the 52-yarder because he really did strike it pretty well. We just can't put ourselves in those predicaments with, those shorter field goals, just going through our technique and just our fundamentals of getting it through right there.
Facing that drastic a change in wind direction on one side of the field or the other, how much does that change, how you would approach, or I guess, Nick, from that point of what you do in those scenarios?
Yeah, it just goes through the communication from the pregame, how the guys feel, what direction. Maybe you're a little bit, you could extend the line probably a little bit more going one way when you do have a little bit of wind. But it just goes throughout the communication throughout the entirety from Jake to Coach Sirianni to myself in terms of what we feel comfortable with, and almost every quarter is a different entity because the winds can obviously switch right there. So it just chalks it up to the communication. And again, in that situation at the end of the game, that was our best chance to put us in a winning situation, possibly get attempt another onside to get it. So, everything we go through is not one we second guess. We feel confident in going throughout the communication from, it doesn't just start in the game. It starts, an hour, 15 minutes before the game when they're out there getting ready.
Is the plan to go back to Gibson when he's healthy, or is this Covey's job going forward?
Yeah, everything's so fluid. You just never know how the roster is going to be dictated week in and week out. Obviously, there's, you get injuries, you get people banged up, scheme, things of that nature. So we just take it day by day and get everybody ready to get their numbers called. Obviously, there's been guys that have been called up on the day of the game. So it's just one of those things where we do here in the special room to make sure everybody's ready to go.
Do you have a preference?
Do I have a preference? I think they've all shown that they can do it at a high level in terms of that. Xavier obviously had the one in Dallas where we'd love to have back, but he also showed some promise there. But then you get Covey, who's shown that he could be a very elite returner when he has the opportunity. So there's really no preference. I think it's just the opportunity to have an abundance of guys that can do it.
Was it an issue? Excuse me. Just waiting for Covey to be fully healthy to kind of get him that chance, or was it more, Xavier getting hurt?
Yeah, I think it's just more of, the influx of how the roster, moves week in and week out. Whether it's injuries, like you said, with Xavier going, having that shoulder injury, then, if a different number on the, a different unit is low, you got to use that from an elevation standpoint. But it just happened to come up that it worked out naturally like that, organically, where, unfortunately Xavier got hurt, and, we're hoping that, he gets fully healthy and ready to roll. Then, having Covey being able to be elevated, then signed to the active right there is always a plus for us. And, it was just from the scouting department being able to give us those options when things do, come up. Obviously, it's a long season.
Onside kicks have been
pretty difficult to recover mathematically, statistically. How do you even like go about trying to find new ways to recover a kick, and what's that process like?
Yeah, it just kind of goes to what Jake likes. Practicing kicks, we practice it throughout the week. A lot of it is just chance. Whether it's a fortuitous bounce that maybe it hits them and now it turns into a scrum more than anything else. I think this past week, I think New Orleans and Miami had one, and it was by a sliver of a hair that he got it past the 10-yard mark. But I thought Jake hit a good ball right there, and you can see that second bounce is always the bounce you're looking for because that's always the one that's most mysterious. And kudos to Chicago and Roma Duze right there to get it down right there. But it took the hop that we thought it would off the grass, and we were just hoping that he misplayed it or it hit him, and now it turns into a scrum.
How much do you guys miss Sydney when he's not fully with the special teams group?
Yeah, I know. In terms of you miss someone, yes, obviously, but that's nothing we hold ourselves on like, hey, we're missing a guy. We can't play at this level. We got to play at every level we possibly can at the highest. I thought, they battled throughout the entirety of the whole thing. And, the one that got out was just a poor, we made a little bit of a fundamental mistake on the kickoff of kind of diving inside instead of outside. But, when you lose a guy that has that caliber of Sydney, obviously it's going to be the entirety of the group to rise to that challenge. And I thought we did some good things. I think the punt coverage is a really good job. And Keely's done a really good job over the last couple of weeks on the outside of Manny, whether it's in the punt return game or as a gunner. Then he made a big tackle for us on kickoff. So it's just one of those things where, again, the greatest sport of all time. It's not just one player. It's all 11 in terms of, giving us the best chance to win.
How do you think Darius performed filling in for Sydney on the outside?
Yeah, I thought Darius did a good job, especially against, Devin Duvernay, who, back in the day in Baltimore, he was a very dangerous returner. We're going out there, running, keeping it boxed in, that return that was going to our left. He did a good job of sending him back, him and Cam Latu. Obviously, we kind of missed a tackle right there, which we would have loved to have inside the 20, but he kind of kicked it back into Keely, and, it goes back to the team game where you're able to flip the field position, with a 48-yard net. Now they have to go into the wind. Hopefully, you're able to flip the field in that case. But I thought Darius did a good job of, having his first real taste of being a four-core special teams player, and he's only going to get better the more times he's going to be out there.
What stands out about the Chargers special teams unit?
Yeah, they're very a physical unit, very similar to how Coach Harbaugh likes his teams. Obviously, firsthand when he was the head coach at Stanford and I was at Oregon, it was always a physical unit. Same as now, they got two linebackers in Wax and Deshaun Phillips that are doing a really good job. You see Tui out there. You see Bud Dupree, a guy that was a first-round draft pick almost a decade ago, now playing special teams and going hard right there. So it's a physical unit. I respect what Fick has done as a coordinator there. So we have our hands full, and obviously they have a dangerous returner in Darius Davis, who, he's had a couple touchdowns called back. He had one this year, I think, called back. So we have to be really good discipline-wise in terms of fanning the field right there, getting in our lane. Integrity in tip-top shape than just being as physical as they are.
We'll do a couple more. A guy like Jihad Campbell, who was playing defense, pretty much the entire game earlier in the season. What is kind of his learning curve as far as playing special teams, and what have you seen from him so far? Yeah,
obviously going through it, it's just the roller coaster of the season for a rookie, but he's done a good job for us. Obviously, he got a little bit more involved over this last week, playing both punt and punt return. But he's done a good job for us. He brings some physicality, brings athleticism, obviously, to the table. So it's just the more times he sees it, the more familiar he is, the faster he's going to play. And I think he's going to keep getting better in terms of that. But he sits in those seats right there, and it's great. He's got Smile, he's got Nakobe. He can lean on Zach Bond, who's played predominantly a lot of special teams early on in his career. Just questions in terms of that, but he's always engaged and wanting to go forward to help this team win in any way he possibly can.
I assume that's probably something he didn't do much of at Alabama.
You always look back and see how much they did play, and obviously with Coach Saban, a lot of those guys did play on the special teams units out there, so it's not foreign to him. But he obviously knows, here in the NFL that third phase is a big priority, and he's done a really good job for us.
In Patrick Johnson's case, you called him up, but if he can't be elevated anymore, how's Josh Uche in that role? Because it's a little different than the way he started the season.
Yeah, and obviously, how the roster fluctuates going up and down. Josh has done a really good job. He made some big tackles for us on kickoff coverage, played some good reps for us on punt return. So, we're always going to piece these guys into the spots that they can excel at. And I'm not going to ask them to do something that they're not comfortable with or they're not going to truly excel at, and I'll find somewhere else to put them in a place where they can.
All right, thanks, everybody.
Thank you.